That July 2nd, 1866, a correspondent to a London newspaper wrote that something had fallen from the sky during a thunderstorm of June 30th, 1866, at Notting Hill. Mr. G. T. Simons of Simon's Meteorological Magazine investigated about as fairly and with about as unprejudiced a mind as anything ever has been investigated. He says that the object was nothing but a lump of coal, that next door to the home of the correspondent, coal had been unloaded the day before. With the uncanny wisdom of the stranger upon unfamiliar ground that we have noted before, Mr. Simmons saw that the coal reported to have fallen from the sky and the coal unloaded more prosaically the day before were identical. Persons in the neighborhood, unable to make this simple identification, had brought from the correspondent pieces of the object reported to have fallen from the sky. As to credulity, I know of no limits for it, but when it comes to paying out money for credulity, oh, the standards to judge by, of course, just the same. The trouble with efficiency is that it will merge away into excess. With what seems to me to be superabundance of convincingness, Mr. Simmons then lugs another character into his little comedy. That it was all a hoax by a chemist's pupil who had filled a capsule with an explosive, and during the storm had it thrown the burning mass into the gutter, so making an artificial thunderbolt. Or even Shakespeare, with all his inartistry, did not lug in King Lear to make Hamlet complete. Whether I'm lugging into something that has no special meaning myself or not, I find that this storm of June 30th, 1866, was peculiar. It is described in the London Times, July 2nd, 1866, that during the storm, the sky in many places remained partially clear, while hail and rain were falling. That may have been more meaning that may have more meaning when we take up the possible extra mundane origin of some hailstones, especially if they fall from a cloudless sky. Mere suggestion, not worth much, that there may have been falls of extra mundane substances in London, June 30th, 1866. Clinkers, said to have fallen during a storm in Kilburn, July 5th, 1877. According to the Kilburn Times, July 7th, 1877, quoted by Mr. Simmons, a street that had been literally strewn during the storms with a mass of clinkers, estimated at about 2 bushels, sizes from that of a walnut to that of a man's head. Pieces of the clinkers can be seen at the Kilburn Times office. If these clinkers or cinders were refuse from one of the super mercantile constructions from which coke and coal and ashes occasionally fall to this earth, or rather to the super Sargasso Sea from which dislodgment by tempests occurs, it is intermediatistic to accept that they must merge away somewhere with local phenomena of the scene of precipitation. If a, if a red hot stove should drop from a cloud in Broadway, someone would find that at about the time of the occurrence a moving van had passed, and that the moving men had tired of the stove or something. That it had not been really red hot, but had been rogued instead of blackened by some absent minded housekeeper. Compared with some of the scientific explanations that we have encountered, there's considerable restraint, I think, in that one. Mr. Simmons learned that in the same street he emphasizes that it was a short street. There was a fire engine station. I had such an impression of him hustling and bustling around at Notting Hill, searching cellars until he found one with newly arrived coal in it, ringing doorbells, exciting a whole neighborhood, calling up to second story windows, stopping people in the streets, hotter and hotter on the trail of a wretched impostor of a chemist's pupil. After his efficiency at Notting Hill, we expect to hear that he went to the station and something like this. It is said that clinkers fell in your street about 10 minutes past 4 o'clock, afternoon of July 5th. Will you look over your records and tell me where your engine was at about 10 minutes past 4, July 5th? Mr. Simmons says, I think that most probably they had been raked out of the steam fire engine. July 20th, 1880, it was reported that a thunderstorm had struck the house at 180 Oakley Street, Chelsea, falling down the chimney into the kitchen grate. Mr. Simmons investigated. He describes the thunderstone as an agglomeration of brick, soot, unburned coal, and cinder. He says that, in his opinion, lightning had flashed down the chimney and had fused some of the brick of it. He does think it remarkable that the lightning did not then scatter the contents of the grate, which were distributed only as if a heavenly body had fallen. If we admit that climbing up the chimney to find out is too rigorous a requirement for a man who may have been large, dignified, and subject to expansions, the only unreasonableness we find in what he says, as judged by our more modern outlook, is, I suppose that no one would suggest that bricks are manufactured in the atmosphere. Sounds a little unreasonable to us because it is so of the sounds a little unreasonable to us because it is so of the positivistic spirit of former times when it was not so obvious that the highest incredibility and laughability must merge away with the proper, as the scientific American or Sci Am Sup would say. The preposterous is always interpretable in terms of the proper, with which it must be continuous, or clay-like masses such as have fallen from the sky, tremendous heat generated by their velocity, they bake bricks. We begin to suspect that Mr. Simmons exhausted himself at Notting Hill. It's a warning to efficiency fanatics. Then the instance of 3 lumps of earthly matter found upon a well-frequented path after a thunderstorm at Reading, July 3rd, 1883. There are so many records of the fall of earthly matter from the sky that it would seem almost uncanny to find resistance here, were we not so accustomed to an uncompromising stance of orthodoxy, which, in our metaphysics, represent good as attempts, but evil in their insufficiency. If I thought it necessary, I'd list 150 instances of earthly matter said to have fallen from the sky. It is his antagonism to atmospheric disturbances associated with the fall of things from the sky that blinds and hypnotizes a Mr. Simmons here. This especial Mr. Simmons rejects the reading substance because it was not of true meteoric material. It's uncanny, or it's not uncanny at all, but universal. If you don't take something for a standard of opinion, you can't have any opinion at all. But if you do take a standard in some of its applications, it must be preposterous. The carbonaceous meteorites, which are unquestioned, though avoided, as we have seen, by orthodoxy, are more glaringly of untrue meteoric material than was the substance of reading. Mr. Simmons says that these 3 lumps were upon the ground in the first place. Whether these data are worth preserving or not, I think that the appeal that this especial Mr. Simmons makes is worthy of a place in the museum we're writing. He argues against belief in all external origins for our credit as Englishmen. He is a patriot. But I think that these foreigners had a small chance. In the first place, for hospitality from him. Then comes a small lump of iron 2 inches in diameter, said to have fallen during a thunderstorm at Brixton, August 17, 1887. Mr. Simmons says, at present, I cannot trace it. He was at his best at Notting Hill. There's been a marked falling off in his later manner. In the London Times, February 1st, 1888, it is said that a roundish object of iron had been found after a violent thunderstorm in a garden at Brixton, August 17th, 1877. It was analyzed by a chemist who could not identify it as true meteoric material. Whether a product of workmanship like human workmanship or not, this object is described as an oblate spheroid about 2 inches across its major diameter. The chemist's name and address are given: Mr. J. James Morgan, Ebb Vale. Garden, familiar ground. I suppose that Mr. Simmons' opinion this symmetric object had been upon the ground in the first place, though he neglects to say this, but we do note that he described this object as a lump, which does not suggest a spheroidal or symmetric. It is our notion that the word lump was because of its meaning and amorphousness used purposely to have the next datum stand alone, remote, without similars. If Mr. Simmons had said that there had been a report of another round object that had fallen from the sky, his readers would be attracted by an agreement. He distracts his readers by describing in terms of the unprecedented iron cannonball. It was found in a manure heap in Sussex after a thunderstorm. However, Mr. Simmons argues pretty reasonably, it seems to me, that, given a cannonball in a manure heap in the first place, lightning might be attracted by it, and, if seen to strike there, the untutored mind or mentally below the average would leap or jump or proceed with less celerity to the conclusion that the iron object had fallen. Except that, if every farmer isn't upon very familiar ground, or if every farmer doesn't know his own manure heap as well as Mr. Simmons knew his writing desk, then comes the instance of a man, his wife, and his 3 daughters at Casterton, Westmoreland, who were looking out at their lawn during a thunderstorm, when they considered, as Mr. Simmons expressed it, that they saw a stone fall from the sky, killed a sheep, and bury itself in the ground. They dug. They found a stone ball. Simmons: coincidence. It had been there in the first place. This object was exhibited at a meeting of the Royal Meteorological Society by Mr. C. Carus Wilson. It is described in the journal's list of exhibits as a sandstone ball. It is described as sandstone by Mr. Simmons. Now, a round piece of sandstone may be almost anywhere in the ground in the first place, but by our more or less discreditable habit of prying and snooping, we find that this object was rather more complex and of material less commonplace. In snooping through knowledge, October 9th, 1885, we read that this thunderstone was in the possession of Mr. C. Carus Wilson, who tells the story of the witnesses of his family: the sheep killed, the burial of something in the earth, the digging, and the finding. Mr. C. Carus Wilson describes the object as a ball of hard ferruginous quartzite, about the size of a coconut, weigh about 12 pounds. Whether we're feeling around for significance or not, there is a suggestion not only of symmetry but of structure in this object. It had an external shell separated from a loose nucleus. Mr. Carus Wilson attributes this cleavage to unequal cooling of the mass. My own notion is that there is very little deliberate misrepresentation in the writings of scientific men, that they are quite as guiltless in intent as are other hypnotic subjects. Such a victim of induced belief reads of a stone ball said to have fallen from the sky. Mechanically in his mind arise impressions of globular lumps or nodules of sandstone, which are common almost everywhere. He assimilates the reported fall with his impressions of objects in the ground in the first place. To an intermediate, The phenomena of intellection are only phenomena of universal process localized in human minds. The process called explanation is only a local aspect of universal assimilation. It looks like materialism, but the intermediate holds that interpretation of the immaterial as it is called in terms of the material as it is called is no more rational than interpretation of the material in terms of the immaterial. That there is in quasi existence neither the material nor the immaterial, but approximations one way or the other. But so hypnotic quasi reasons, the globular lumps of sandstone are common, whether he jumps or leaps, or whether only the frowsy and base born are so athletic. His is the impression by assimilation that this especial object is a ball of sandstone, or human mentality, its inhabitants are conveniences. It may be that Mr. Symonds' paper was written before this object was exhibited to the members of the society, and with the charity with which, for the sake of diversity, we intersperse our malices, we are willing to accept that he investigated something that he had never seen. But whoever listed this object was uncareful. It is listed as sandstone. We're making excuses for them. Really, as it were, we're not quite as damned as we were. One does not apologize for the gods and at the same time feel quite utterly prostrate before them. If this were a real existence and all of us real persons with real standards to judge by, I'm afraid we'd have to be a little severe with some of these. Mr. Symonds's, as it were, of course, seriousness seems out of place. We note an amusing little touch in the indefinite allusion to all men, who with his unnamed family had considered that he had seen a stone fall. The man was Reverend W. Carus Wilson, who was a well-known in his day. The next instance was reported by W. B. Tripp, F.R.M.S., that during a thunderstorm, a farmer had seen the ground in front of him plowed up by something that was luminous. Dug, bronze axe. My own notion is that an expedition to the North Pole could not be so urgent as that representative scientists should have gone to that farmer and there spent a summer studying this one reported occurrence. As it is, an unnamed farmer somewhere, no date. The thing must stay damned. Another specimen for our museum is a comment in nature upon these objects, that they are of an amusing character, thus clearly showing that they were of terrestrial, not celestial character. Just why celestiality? Or that of it which, too, is only of intermediateness, should not be quite as amusing as terrestriality is beyond our reasoning powers, which we have agreed are not ordinary. Of course, there is nothing amusing about wedges and spheres at all, or Archimedes or Euclid are humorists. It is that they were described derisively. If you'd like a little specimen of the standardization of orthodox opinion, they are of an amusing character, thus clearly showing that they were of terrestrial and not a celestial character. I'm sure, not positively, of course, that we've tried to be as easygoing and lenient with Mr. Symonds as his obviously scientific performance would permit. Of course, it may be that subconsciously we are prejudiced against him, instinctively classing him with St. Augustine, Darwin, St. Jerome, and Lyell. As to the thunderstones, I think that he investigated them mostly for the credit of Englishmen, or in the spirit of the Royal Krakatoa Committee, or about as the Commission from the French Academy investigated meteorites. According to a writer in Knowledge 5-418, the Krakatoa Committee attempted not in the least to prove what had caused the atmospheric effects of 1883, but to prove that Krakatoa did it. Altogether, I should think that the following quotation should be enlightening to anyone who still thinks that these occurrences were investigated, not to support an opinion formed in advance. In opening his paper, Mr. Simmons says that he undertook his investigation as to the existence of thunderstones, or thunderbolts, as he calls them, feeling certain that there was a weak point somewhere, inasmuch as thunderbolts have no existence. We have another instance of the reported fall of a cannonball. It occurred prior to Mr. Simmons' investigations, but is not mentioned by him. It was investigated, however, in the Proc Royal Society Eden 3-147, is the report of a thunderstone supposed to have fallen in Hampshire, September 1852. It was an iron cannonball, or it was a large nodule of iron pyrites or bisulphuret of iron. Not one had seen it fall. It had been noticed upon a garden path. For the first time after a thunderstorm. It was only a supposed thing because it had not the character of any known meteorite. In the London Times, September 16, 1852, appears a letter from Mr. George E. Bailey, a chemist of Andover, Hants. He says that in a very heavy thunderstorm, of the first week of September 1852, this iron object had fallen in the garden of Mr. Robert Dowling of Andover, that it had fallen upon a path within 6 yards of the house. It had been picked up immediately after the storm by Mr. Dowling. It was about the size of a cricket ball, weight 4 pounds. No one had seen it fall. In the Times, September 15th, 1852, there is an account of this thunderstorm, which was of unusual violence. There are some other data relative to the ball of quartz of Westmoreland. They're poor things. There's so little to them that they look like ghosts of the damned. However, ghosts, when multiplied, take on what is called substantiality. If the solidest things conceivable in quasi-existence is only concentrated phantasmosity. There we go. It is not only that there have been other reports of quartz that have fallen from the sky, there is another agreement. The round quartz object of Westmoreland, if broken open and separated from its loose nucleus, would be a round, hollow quartz object. My pseudo-position is that 2 reports of similar extraordinary occurrences, one from England and one from Canada, are interesting. That at a meeting of the Institute of December 1st, 1888, one of the members, Mr. J. A. Livingston, exhibited a globular quartz body which he asserted had fallen from the sky. It had been split open. It was hollow. But the other members of the Institute decided that the object was spurious because it was not of true meteoric material. No date, no place mentioned. We note the suggestion that it was only a geode which had been upon the ground in the first place. Its crystalline lining was geode-like. Quartz is upon the Index Prohibitory of Science. A monk who would read Darwin would sin no more, would the scientist who would admit that, except by the up and down process, quartz has ever fallen from the sky. But continuity, it is not excommunicated if part of or incorporated in a baptized meteorite, St. Catherine's of Mexico, I think. It's as Epicurean a distinction as any ever made by theologians. Fassig lists a quartz pebble found in a hailstone. Bibliography Part 2-335. Up and down, of course, another object of quartzite was reported to have fallen in the autumn of 1880 at Schroon Lake, New York, said in the Scientific American 43-272 to be a fraud. It was not the usual. About the 1st of May, 1899, the newspapers published a story of a snow white meteorite that had fallen at Vincennes, Indiana. The editor of the Monthly Weather Review requested the local observer at Vincennes to investigate. The editor says that the thing was only a fragment of a quartz boulder. He says that anyone with at least a public school education should know better than to write that quartz has ever fallen from the sky. That in the London Museum of Antiquities there is a disc of quartz 6 centimeters by 5 millimeters, about 5 centimeters, said to have fallen upon a plantation in the Dutch West Indies after a meteoric explosion. Bricks. I think this is a vice we're writing. I recommend it to those who have hankered for a new sin. At first, some of our data were of so frightful or ridiculous mien as to be hated or eyebrowed was only to be seen. Then some pity crept in. I think that we can now embrace bricks. The baked clay idea was all right in its place, but it rather lacks distinction, I think. With our minds upon the concrete boats that have been building terrestrially lately, and thinking of wrecks that may occur to some of them, and of a new material for the deep-sea fishes to disregard. Object that fell at Richland, South Carolina, yellow to gray, said to look like a piece of brick. Pieces of a furnace-made brick said to have fallen in a hailstorm at Padua, August 1834. The writer offered an explanation that started another convention, that the fragments of bricks had been knocked from buildings by hailstones. But there is here a concomitant that will be disagreeable to anyone who may have been inclined to smile at the now digestible enough notion that furnace-made bricks have fallen from the sky. It is that in some of the hailstones, 2% of them that were found with the pieces of brick was a light grayish powder. Padre Secchi explains that a stone said to have fallen in a thunderstorm at Supino, Italy, September 1875, had been knocked from a roof. That it had been reported that a good-sized stone of form clearly artificial had fallen at Naples, November 1885. The stone was described by 2 professors of Naples who had accepted it as inexplicable but vertible. They were visited by Dr. H. Johnstone Levis, the correspondent to Nature, whose investigations had convinced him that the object was a shoemaker's lapstone. Now, to us of the initiated, or to us of the wider outlook, there is nothing incredible in the thought of a shoemaker's in other worlds. But I suspect that this characterization is tactical. This object of worked stone, or the shoemaker's lapstone, was made of Vesuvian lava. Dr. Johnstone Levis thinks most probably of lava of the flow of 1631 from the La Scala quarries. We condemn most probably as bad positivism. As to the men of position who had accepted that this thing had fallen from the sky, I have now obliged them to admit their mistake, says Dr. Johnstone Levis, or it's always the stranger in Naples who knows La Scala lava better than the natives know it. Explanation: that the thing had been knocked from or thrown from a roof. As to attempt to trace the occurrences to any special roof, nothing said upon that subject. or that Dr. Johnstone Lavis called a carved stone a lapstone, quite as Mr. Symonds calls a spherical object a cannonball, bent upon a discrediting incredulity, shoemaking, and celestiality. It is so easy to say that axes or wedge shaped stones found on the ground were there in the first place, and that it is only coincidence that lightning should strike near one. But the credibility of coincidences decreases as the square root of their volume, I think. Our massed instances speak too much of coincidences, but the axe or wedge-shaped objects that have been found in trees are more difficult for orthodoxy. For instance, Argaro accepts that such finds have occurred, but he argues that if wedge-shaped stones have been found in tree trunks, so have toads been found in tree trunks. Did the toads fall there? Not at all bad for a hypnotic. Of course, in our acceptance, the Irish are the chosen people. It's because they are characteristically best in accord with the underlying essence of quasi existence. Mr. Argaro answers a question by asking another question. That's the only way a question can be answered in our Hyberian kind of an existence. Dr. Botting argued with the natives of the Santo Parganas, India, who said that cut and shaped stones had fallen from the sky, some of them lodging in tree trunks. Mr. Botting, with orthodox notions of velocity of falling bodies, having missed, I suppose, some of the notes I have upon large hailstones, which, for size, have fallen with astonishingly low velocity, argued that anything falling from the sky would be smashed to atoms. He accepts that objects of worked stone have been found in tree trunks, but he explains that the Santals often steal trees, but do not chop them down in the usual way, because that would be to make too much noise. They insert stone wedges and hammer them instead. Then, if they should be caught, wedges would not be the evidence against them, the axes would be. Or that a scientific man can't be desperate and reasonable too. Or that a pickpocket, for instance, is safe though caught with his hand in one's pocket, if he's gloved. Say, because no court in the land would regard a gloved hand in the same way in which a bare hand would be regarded. That there's nothing but intermediateness to the rational and the preposterous. That this that this status of our own ratiocinations is perceptible wherein they are upon the unfamiliar. Dr. Botting collected 50 of these shaped stones, said to have fallen from the sky in the course of many years. He says that the Santals are a highly developed race, and for ages have not used stone implements, except in this one nefarious convenience to them. All explanations are localizations. They fade away before the universal. It is difficult to express that black rains in England do not originate in the smoke of factories, less difficult to express that black rains of South Africa do not. We utter little stress upon the absurdity of Dr. Botting's explanation, because if anything's absurd, everything's absurd, or rather has in it some degree or aspect of absurdity, and we've never had experience with any state except something where has in it some degree or aspect of absurdity, and we've never had experience with any state except something somewhere between ultimate absurdity and final reasonableness. Our acceptance is that Dr. Botting's elaborate explanation does not apply to cut stone objects found in tree trunks in other lands. We accept that for the general, a local explanation is inadequate. As to thunderstones not said to have fallen luminously, and not said to have been found sticking in trees, we are told by faithful hypnotics that astonished rustics come upon prehistoric axes that have been washed into sight by rains and jump jump to the conclusion that things have fallen from the sky, but simple rustics come upon many prehistoric things: scrapers, pottery, knives, hammers. We have no record of rusticity coming upon old pottery after a rain, reporting the fall of a bowl from the sky.